certificate, a degree I think most of us would agree no longer bestows the prestige it once did. Campuses are increasingly in the news for free speech controversies, not always academic excellence, and the pandemic, I believe, has exposed pre-existing concerns in the way universities are run and in the way they are funded. So does the UK need to take another long, hard look at what some may consider our crumbling higher education system? So I'm delighted to be joined by 4 excellent guests today to give their views on the topic. Firstly, we have Dr. Steve Davies, who is the Head of Education at the Institute of Economic Affairs. He facilitates our outreach to students and young people across the country. He's the author of numerous books and publications. He has recently contributed to the IEA's collection of free speech essays discussing censorship on campus, and in 2020, last year, wrote To a Radical Degree, Reshaping the UK's Higher Education in the Post-Pandemic World, which you can get a copy of over there on the table when you leave. He argues that the pandemic has bursted the bubble in universities and higher education and exposed the fundamentally unsound nature of the policy of successive governments and of the entire array of higher education institutions. We also have, to my right, Professor Andy Westwood, who is Vice Dean for Social Responsibility at the University of Manchester. He's also Professor of Government Practice, and he is also a visiting Professor of Further and Higher Education at the University of Wolverhampton, and a governor at the National Institute of Economic and Social Research. He's also recently worked as a specialist advisor to the Select Committee on Economic Affairs and Digital Skills in the House of Lords. He's been a special advisor to ministers on education skills and science policy at the Department for Innovation, University and Skills, and a senior advisor at the Treasury and in the Departments for Education, Communities and Local Government. It's quite a lot you've done there. That's a long CV. And to my left is Darren Grimes.
First time for everything.
Darren is a bit of a surprise guest this morning, but I'm glad he's agreed to join us. He is a political commentator, a journalist, and host of Reasons UK, which is a conservative digital platform. He previously worked at the IEA as digital manager, and you may know him best from his endeavours to get Brexit across the line. And then, of course, to my left, we have Robert Halfon, who, his biography is here, has been a Member of Parliament for Harlow since 2010 and is elected Chair of the Commons Education Select Committee. Thank you so much for joining us today. So I think I'd like to first start with 5 minutes each from each of our speakers, essentially asking that question, is university still worth it? If you could keep your times to about 5 minutes, I'll keep an eye on the clock, that would be fantastic. And then I'd like to take as many questions from the audience. I'm sure you've got a lot of interesting points to make yourselves. So Steve, should we start with you?
Okay, thanks, Emily. Well, my answer to the question is that given what most people going to university these days want to get out of it, sadly, it's not. And also that it's not worth it given the justification that's normally given for an expanded higher education by the political leaders. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, in my view, going to university should be a consumption good, not an investment good. It should be something that you do because you want to broaden your mind, find out more about something that you really are interested in, discover new things both about yourself and about the world of ideas and the world of knowledge. And I think you can still do that, although it is getting more difficult, I have to say, all the time. But sadly, I think that is not actually, from my own experience in the sector as a teacher and also from observation, that's not the main motive for most people who go to universities these days. The main motive is simply to get a certificate, to acquire a degree which will send a signal to future employers, basically. And that is why the decline in the graduate premium, as it's called, the lifetime earnings premium, is such a significant factor, because currently 35% of people who've graduated in the last 5 or 6 years are in occupations that don't require a degree. So that signalling model, which is what most people are prepared to go to university for and what they're prepared to incur student debt for, it's just not working anymore. And increasingly also, there are other ways of doing this. So Google, 2 years ago, launched their career certificate program, which is basically an online kind of program which gives you a certificate which does the same job, sends a signal to employers for a fraction of the cost of going to university and without taking up a large amount of your time and involving you going out of the labour force. So I think that essentially we are overproducing graduates, if you want to use graduate status as a signal of employability, which is what we've increasingly been doing. And I think that the problems with free speech that our chair alluded to are actually due to this overproduction of elites, as it's sometimes called. It's because there's a kind of intense competition for status amongst graduates now, particularly in certain sectors such as the media, publishing, and the like. Now, the other reason which is normally given for having an enlarged higher education sector is for skills acquisition, that it's all about training and producing a skilled labour force. Two problems with that. One is that the great majority of graduates do not use any, and I repeat, any of the skills and knowledge that they acquire at university in their subsequent employment. There are some cases where they do, obviously, like doctors, veterinary surgeons, engineers, basically people who've got STEM subject degrees in many cases, but mostly not at all. That doesn't mean the degree isn't worth it. If you've gone there with the first kind of goal in mind, to expand your mind, then it is worth it. But what it means is that it's a misconception to think that the main function of universities in practice is to produce a skilled labour force. And focusing upon higher education enables us to draw a veil over one of the huge and long-term failures of the British state, which is to have adequate vocational education. This is a problem that goes back as far as the 1880s, believe it or not, which is a very depressing thing to think about, that we do not have an adequate skills and vocation-based education system. And once again, there are many cheaper, more effective alternatives. You can do a degree-level apprenticeship. You can do professional qualifications run by industries, standards bodies. You can study online through the various platforms that are now beginning to appear. So if you want a skilled labour force, I would submit that liberal arts universities are not the place to do it. They have a different function, one that sadly is being crowded out by those two other functions, both of which they're no longer meeting properly.
Thank you, Steve. Andrew, would you like to give us your thoughts?
Of course, and thank you for asking me. I'm delighted to be here. I was going to say welcome to Manchester until I realised Steve had lived here for 40 years. But welcome all of you to Manchester. It's very nice to see you here, and you should come more often. It's a great city. Let me start with where I agree with Steve, and where I agree, I guess, with kind of lots of the kind of premise in the introduction that Emily set out. I mean, firstly, that we have long-standing problems in our skills and vocational education training system. I would say it goes back to the 16th century. If you want to look for the first piece of legislation on skills is actually the Statute of Artificiers, excuse me, which regulated the length of apprenticeships. Artificers,
yeah.
Okay.
Which regulated the length of apprenticeships. It was repealed in the 19th century for being too burdensome on employers, but these things take time, as we know. So the point is that has been a long-standing weakness in our system, and the kind of the policy-making framework and the kind of culture and the kind of economic structure of the country, and certainly the policy framework in recent years, has put much more emphasis and much more funding on higher education and on full-time degrees. And often when we talk about the value of higher education, we're talking about the value of full-time residential honours degrees. It's not the same thing. So, for example, one of the areas that's very weak is the provision of sub-degree vocational education and training, level 4 and 5. If you've read the Auger Review, I know some of you have, he refers to that as the missing middle in the British education system, and it is the missing middle. More so in the English education system. It's slightly more developed in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, but it's much more developed in other countries, in Australia, in the US, in kind of South Korea, you name it. 30-40% in Germany, sort of up to 50% are going through that route. In the UK and England, it's kind of between 5 and 10%. So that is a particular weakness of the higher education system. Level 4, 5 and 6 and above are essentially is what we make up, what we define as the higher education system. Interestingly, in Steve's paper, we spend a lot of time talking about the 50% target and Blair's 50% target. I wasn't responsible for it, by the way. But actually that target applied to level 4, 5 and 6. It wasn't just about school leavers going to university. So, you know, we need to kind of understand that context. It's about the breadth. But what we've seen over the last 20 years is a kind of narrowing of that. So that kind of our higher education system has become more homogenised around the full-time degree. So more people who consume higher education do it in the form of a full-time residential kind of honours degree. And, you know, we have the youngest graduates average age in the OECD as a consequence. We have some of that disconnect between the supply of graduates and the kind of demand in the labour market as a result. You know, the overlap is smaller, less people in part-time higher education, less adults doing higher education. And, you know, all of those things are things that we need to fix. All of those things are the things that kind of Augur essentially landed on and said, we need to fix these things because it's just not good for our system, the way we provide it, but also the way we use the skills that come out of the higher education system. So that's enough background. In the kind of...
You've got 2 minutes left.
In the 2 minutes I've got left, let me kind of go to two other points that I think are important. This conference, it seems to me, is largely about two things. It's about levelling up, and it's about how we transition to a high skills, high productivity economy. And it seems to me that we often have the debate about higher education and full-time degrees without thinking about those two things. You know, what role does the degree, what role does the university, what role does level 4 and 5, what role does that play in levelling up, in the kind of regional inequalities that are kind of essentially one of the big themes of this conference? DFE doesn't really answer that with its policy. There's no great incentives for universities or colleges to think locally, or to act locally, or to kind of do any of the stuff that might make a material difference to those places. That's a bad place to be. So that's the first thing. The second thing is what skills do we need to supply to complete that transition to a higher skill, higher wage, higher productivity economy? Well, I will say to the kind of, you know, to ministers who wish to do that, you know, ministers have been trying to do that for the last 30 or 40 years. A, it takes time, and B, you really, really have to understand what you're trying to achieve, not just with the supply of high-level skills, graduates, and what kind of universities and colleges do, but kind of how the demand sort of pulls that through and utilises and deploys those skills. It's exactly the same challenge with research and development. You know, you can pump lots of money in. How do you use it and apply it so that it kind of, you know, helps pull through jobs and wages towards that kind of economy that this conference is largely kind of talking about?
Thank you, Andrew. Darren.
My voice is a little bit like the UK's university sector in the sense that it's creaking at the seams and not fit for purpose, so you'll have to bear with us. But I'm sort of... Chris Skidmore, the former universities minister, wrote this piece recently for The Telegraph in which he said people like me focusing on too many people going to university are missing the point. And I'm not sure that we are, actually, because I'm swiftly coming to the view that all universities are good for at the minute is creating a new generation of the ultra-offended somewhere to the left of Chairman Mao. So, you know, I'm not convinced that too many people are making that argument. There aren't enough of us, if you ask me. But I'm someone that dropped out of university, so I'm one of those liberal arts types who... you know, turns out not to have been all that liberal, but there we are. I definitely am of the view that that was a complete waste of money on my part. And I'm not sure that, given, I can remember being back at school and a careers advisor saying to me, you'll never get into university. And I remember feeling crushed by that and feeling like my whole life, you know, would amount to nothing. And that's what we're convincing kids, I'm afraid, at the minute. And I think we're selling them a lie, frankly. We are selling them a lie that says that you will go to university and you will be guaranteed top-tier jobs for the rest of your life. That's not true. It's not how it works, right? You can leave university these days and end up, as I did a hairdressing qualification, believe it or not. And actually that did a hell of a lot more for my confidence and I guess professionalism in the workplace. It allowed me to build that confidence in the skill set to actually be a functioning adult in the world of work. And I'm afraid that everything from grade inflation to, nowadays you've got kids leaving with degrees who are saying, well, actually, mum and dad, I need to go get a master's because it's not quite enough these days having a degree. So I need to go on. And you just think more and more debt that you're accruing. And for what? What purpose is it serving? That's what I want to know. That's what I want these people spending our money to answer. And I don't think Chris Skidmore and other Conservative politicians have done a good enough job at saying that. Skidmore actually argued that modern universities train students for vocational careers, which I think is sort of Steve touched on slightly. But I've lost count of the number of people that say to me time and time again, don't be daft. These are the kinds of things that you learn in the world of work. These are the kinds of things that you will learn on your feet in the job. And I'm not convinced that doing a degree and then going into an apprenticeship level position is actually eminently sensible. And don't get me started on the 50% target. I think it's another bad policy that has to go. We've, I think, spent a lot of time talking about Blair's bad policies that we're cleaning up at the minute. But I think the issue for me also is one of injustice of, well, is it working for the taxpayer? Because if you consider the fact that the government reckons that it'll write off 53% of the value of student-issued loans. Now, you consider the fact, do I really think that everyone in this room that pays taxes, it's good value for money that you are having to pay for the degree that I dropped out of? Ultimately, no, not really. I'm not convinced of that. And I reckon, actually, as far as what the individual is being offered, the taxpayer has actually contributed quite a lot and isn't getting much in the way of return. I am not convinced that it sort of molds you into the type of, gives you the skill set that you need these days, unless, of course, you are wanting to go out and be a reactionary or an activist or work for Novara Media. I'm not convinced that you are going to come out and be sort of timely. And if you consider the fact that for many years in this country, every Prime Minister from, I think, Harold Wilson up to John Major went to grammar schools and things like that. These are the sorts of things that I think we should be talking about. I don't want to be talking about universities and how kids need degrees. I'm not convinced, as I say, that kids do need degrees. I think kids, like my siblings, need to actually focus on the fact that my two other brothers are vastly different to me, both in and out of factory work, and they're the sort of kids that could have benefited massively from vocational work, apprenticeships and all these other things, and they weren't convinced of that. They weren't taught that. They weren't told that. They were told that they were failures if they didn't go to university, and frankly, I think that's an absurd and reckless thing to teach kids. So no, I think the university sector is failing massively, as you can probably tell, but there we are.
There's Darren Grimes, always sitting on the fence. Now to Robert Halfon.
Thank you, and good morning, everyone. I mean, I went to university. I had an incredible time at Exeter University some years ago now, sadly. But I have come to the view that actually, for the most part, of course, there are some incredible universities. Our higher education system is failing us in a number of big ways. And I think that higher education is stuck in the past and doesn't recognise the world as the world we're about to enter. I mean, I think it's failing big time on helping disadvantaged pupils. Of course, there will be a statistic that says more disadvantaged pupils are going to university, but the reality is more these pupils often drop out. They don't go to the Russell Group universities. I also think that universities are failing big time on skills. The mantra should never have been university, university, university. It should have been skills, skills, skills. We have a huge skills deficit in our country. We have 10 million illiterate adult, or 9 million illiterate and innumerate adults. We are behind the OECD in our skills, but also universities are failing, many of them, to do perhaps the most important thing, which is provide graduates with proper graduate paid jobs. And just pre-coronavirus, a fifth and a third of graduates ended up in non-graduate job, and that's after taking on a whacking loan. And going back to the disadvantage, I recently, my committee, we did a big report on why it is that white working class boys and girls underperform compared to almost every other ethnic group. Just 16% of white working class boys and girls go to university, worse than every other ethnic group except for Roma and Gypsy children. So there is a real big failure there, and yet £800 million is given to universities for the so-called Access Fund that I think is being spent in the wrong way. And if you just quote, the Times last week had an article about Kent University and St Andrews University. University of Kent students must take a course that suggests that wearing second-hand clothes and using swear words can be an example of white privilege. This is from the Times. It's not dare I say it, from Darren's website. St Andrews doing something similar. I can go through the numerous Times articles. Now, and you wonder why there aren't more white working class boys and girls going to university. And I think, and then we have the current problem, of course, where many universities are not even providing face-to-face tuition. And I think that is unacceptable. I think that given that students are taking out £9,000 plus loans, they should be getting a proper service. And if the universities aren't providing that, then they should get their money back, because we already have a brilliant online university that helps the disadvantaged, that has incredible record, and that's the Open University. In my view, one of the great educational institutions in our country, and I think that could be a model. But if people are going to pay £9,000, £9,500, they should be getting, universities should be, does what it says on the tin, they should be getting proper face-to-face tuition. And the Office for Students should be hammering these universities and asking them why they don't have more white working class boys and girls. So what I think needs to happen is just a number of things. First, we look at universities in the wrong way. We regard good universities as ones that do research, like the Russell Group universities, even though many non-Russell Group universities do actually much better and help disadvantaged pupils much better than many Russell Group universities. So we look at league tables in the wrong way, and the universities are marketed in the wrong way, because students want to go to Russell Group universities because they think they are the main prestigious ones. Whereas if you look at a university like Nottingham Trent, incredible results, huge amounts of students from disadvantaged backgrounds, and yet those universities are not top of the league, a so-called Russell Group, because basically historic snobbery, and because people regard research as are more important than getting students jobs and helping disadvantaged pupils climb the ladder of opportunity. So the league tables and the way we look at universities need to change. The second thing that we need to do is that every single course a student does, whether it's history or whether it's archaeology, or whether it's science, should be about work. So they not just taking a year in between, but like part of the week doing a job. So if you are a historian, you would work perhaps in a museum or in an archaeology site. If you're an English student, you would work at a publisher. Every course should be about preparing students for the world of work. And the reason why graduates aren't getting graduate jobs is because it's not doing enough to prepare students for the world of work. The biggest thing, and I would describe as my two favourite words in the English language, are degree apprenticeships, because I think that solves so many problems. Because what you do is you give people some university experience, students, but you give them a proper high-level apprenticeships. They get jobs at the end of it. They earn while they learn, and there's no debt at all, so you don't discourage disadvantaged students to come. And they're in the world of work. You're preparing them for the world of work and getting them jobs. And we know that 90% of apprentices who complete their apprenticeship get good jobs. And I have met degree apprenticeships all over the country, from nursing degree apprenticeships to policing degree apprenticeships to engineering degree apprenticeships, and they get paid more. The statistics now show that these apprentices are actually getting paid more than graduates doing academic degrees. So we need a revolution in higher education. As I said, I had a brilliant time at university. I loved my time there. But the world has changed. We are entering the world of artificial intelligence, automation. 28% of jobs could be lost by young people. The universities have not moved with the time. They've relied on the golden goose of student loans, and that's got to change as well. If anything, we need to move to a graduate tax and lower the interest rates to make it fairer. But let's make sure that universities are about skills, and that they meet our skills needs. They help disadvantaged people climb the ladder of opportunity, and they make sure that they get students proper jobs when they come out.
There we go. Thank you, Robert. Skills, and a revolution in education. Great stuff. So, if I may, I will ask the first question before I come to the audience. We've got a roving mic, so if you could keep your questions short, or at least with a question at the end, that would be great. I'm sure there's lots of people with a multitude of different experiences, so I'd like to hear from as many of you as we can. Just one question that I have. I edit a website called 1828, and most of our writers are very young. A lot of them are students. And of course, they've been very fed up with the last 18 months because of the pandemic and the fact that they haven't had face-to-face teaching and so on. And what I find interesting about this is that actually it doesn't seem to have impacted, and the debt and everything that comes with going to university, all those concerns that we've raised today, it doesn't seem to impact the number of people who are applying to university. So I wonder why that is, and how we can improve the quality of degrees, and whether it should be up to teachers or society or government to dissuade or discourage some students from going down that route, because it may not be the best for them. So I've mixed a few things in there, but I mean, would you like to answer that?
Which bit's the question?
Well, how do we improve the quality of degrees or dissuade some students from going to university?
Well, let me try and answer that in one way. You're right that kind of the experience over the last year, and I should say that kind of, I teach on a number of courses at the university down the road. I also do research. And it's been a very, very difficult year. I mean, we weren't allowed to teach by the government until May. So, colleges and schools could go back in March. We weren't allowed to teach face-to-face until the middle of May. So, there's a variety of reasons why that wasn't happening, in other words. On the dissuading point, I want to answer that with a couple of stats, really. So, roughly, I mean, let's put it to the audience. How many people do you think young people apply to university every year? Roughly. I'll give it to the nearest 5,000. 500,000. Not far off. A bit lower. Depends whether we're talking England or the UK, but. Including overseas students, 500,000. Yeah, so about 400k for kind of domestic students. And how many apprenticeships do you think are available to the same 18, 19-year-olds with a level 3 qualification? Under 100,000. Keep going. Keep going. Keep going. Keep going. Keep going. Nearly there.
That's not a lot.
So, so if you're faced with that choice, the system is providing kind of, two very, very clear sets of incentives. They might be the wrong incentives, but that's what the system's creating. We could expect people to do an apprenticeship that's a level 3, but they've already done one. I mean, I agree with Robert. The degree and apprenticeships are also two of my favourite words. But let's create a system that provides more of them, so that there is a meaningful option, because the system's not doing it at the moment. And the second thing I say, just to kind of answer the sort of final point, is that I mentioned the kind of high skill, high wage debates that are rightly going on in the conference. The Prime Minister, the Chancellor, yesterday talked about a decade of wage stagnation. That has applied to graduates too. So when we talk about kind of graduates being in non-graduate jobs or at levels that don't allow them to repay the loans that they've taken out, whether they are good value loans or not, those kind of people entering the labour market are the same people who are suffering from that wage stagnation that kind of we're trying to shift, and that this whole conference is talking about shifting. So, we can't have it both ways, in other words.
Yes, and it's slightly concerning that they're thinking about lowering the threshold to 23,000 that you begin to pay back your student loans. So that's not a great indicator of the leg up degrees are giving you in terms of pay. Steve,
ask them that on the website.
Steve, do you have anything to add?
I think I just add to what Andrew said, a couple of things. One is that, as he says, the there's the strong incentive at the moment to apply to university, and it's partly due to what Darren says, that 17, 16, 18-year-olds are told constantly that their only chance of getting high-paid, or even more importantly, high-status work is to go to university. And there is this notion that if you don't, or even more, if you don't get to the desirable level of university, then your life is over. And I'm constantly trying to tell people that this is simply not true. And the other thing is, I would say, is that I actually think that the target of 50% of in higher education, which is, as Andrew says, not just university, is correct. What I think is wrong is 50% of 18-year-olds in higher education. When I taught at Manchester Polytechnic, as it was, before later Manchester Met down the road, about 25% of our students were non-standard entry, mature students over 25, and they were easily the best students to teach. Way more rewarding to teach than 18-year-olds. I wish I'd gone to university at that age. I would have got so much more out of it had I done that. And I think that's something else we need to think about. Higher education as something that people do at regular intervals throughout their life, maybe, more the lifelong learning model.
Absolutely.
Great. Robert or Darren, would you like to add to that before we go to the audience?
I'd just say I absolutely agree with you that if we're going to do degree apprenticeships properly, there's got to be a massive change. And I would have I would have a target of 50% of students over the next 10 years doing degree apprenticeships. But what you said at the end, I mean, we were talking about graduates earning more. A graduate earns less on average 5 years after graduation than a level 5 apprenticeship earns 3 years after completion. So it's changing. Exactly. And what we need to do is get the message out there that actually an apprenticeship, and the government are putting billions of pounds, hundreds of millions of pounds into apprenticeships. Every company gets £3,000 on top of help on training costs and other, for all kinds of, we've had millions of apprenticeships since 2010. So I think we need a huge culture change where we encourage more people to do apprenticeships, and I'd like them to do level 3s, but actually to have get up that ladder of opportunity by progressing from level 3 right up to degree level, not just stopping at level 2 and level 3.
I just think it's important. Steve always raises this point. That's the first time I'd ever heard it, with luxury goods signalling, which is, basically having a degree is owning from a good university is owning a Louis Vuitton bag or something like that, right? Yeah. And I really like that point. But I think it has to come down. You have to go a little bit further back. I think school choice is incredibly important, I think. And if we've learned anything over the last decade, I think it's that. And ensuring that kids are actually given the tools and the experiences to be able to decide what it is they want to do with their lives before saying to them, well, actually, mate, your life's basically over because you've not got into university. Well, actually, university might not be right for you. And I think we've got to give kids the tools and the ability to actually say, right, well, what is my path? Mm-hmm. What am I going to do instead? And we're not doing that at the minute.
Yes, and I think teachers need to, be very open about what options there are available to students who, have different skills. Right, so we can go to the audience now. Wow, okay, a lot of questions. Wow, yes. Okay, should we go to this lady in the fourth row?
Thank you. So I am a university governor. And I'm astonished to hear that hairdressing is not a university degree course, as many other similar things are. And I'm also curious that plumbing and electrical, not engineering, but has never been a university course because it hasn't needed to be because there are plenty of jobs. So my question is the 50% of young people going into university simply a way of manipulating the employment statistics by keeping them out of the employment statistics until they're at least 21?
Robert, would you agree with that?
So just say, if you could just say that again, if that's okay, just so I understand it. Yeah.
Sorry, is the 50% of young people going into university education simply a way of manipulating the employment statistics because they are kept out of the employment market until they're 21?
No, I don't think that's the case. By the way, hairdressing, I know we're talking about hairdressing, there's so much snobbery about hairdressing. And during COVID, nobody understood it. It's worth 2 to 3 billion to our economy, hairdressing and beauty. And everyone knocks. I see in my I just went to a hairdressing academy last Friday in my constituency, and these are students are doing vocational level 3, level 4, and some doing higher, and contributing to our economy. And we should be encouraging things like that. The problem is we have a huge academic snobbery. But in terms of the key point, I don't think it's because of manipulation. I just think that going back to I was the second person in my family to go to university. My father was an immigrant here, and it was very much the culture. Oh my God! I mean, when I went to university, it wasn't Oxbridge. I went to Exeter, but it was even in the local newspapers at the time. We don't have any local newspapers left, hardly at all, but sadly. But it was a big thing, and the culture, especially amongst those from different ethnic backgrounds, is university, and then Blair encouraged it and had this target. But I just think it's completely wrong. I would, if I had known about an apprenticeship or could have done a degree apprenticeship when I was growing up, I would have done it pronto, because I think the world we are about to enter, the world of the fourth industrial revolution, the world post-COVID, we are going to have to change big time, which I tried to set out in my speech. It's why I think the whole nature of university needs to change, and every course must be career-based and a significant amount doing work experience.
I mean, I know we now have lecturers for dog grooming and things of the like. Are we overqualified but perhaps underskilled as a workforce?
No one's asked me to groom any dogs. I mean, I'll have a go. But I think the hairdressing question, I think actually is really interesting. If we were in a kind of an FE debate, and I find myself in lots of those and I enjoy them, we often say we produce too many hairdressers. And I violently disagree with that, like Robert's point. We often kind of undermine what's going on in FE when we kind of have those debates. So I'm really pleased you raised it. But going back to the target, that target hasn't existed for a very long time, not in a formal sense. I think most education secretaries of the last 10 years have all claimed to have abolished it. But if we do go back to the target when it was set, it was for all people in higher education up to the age of 30, including those in work. So apprenticeships, if they were doing an apprenticeship, that counted to the target if it was level 4, level 5, level 6. So in other words, it wasn't a parking strategy to keep people out of the labour market statistics.
Great. Should we get a couple more questions over here? And then if we could take another question at the front, this lady here.
Thanks very much. Andy, you mentioned wage stagnation.
Yeah.
I'll tell you a group that doesn't suffer with wage stagnation. That's university vice-chancellors. Their salaries...
Yes.
Their salaries are outrageous. I'm a leader of a council in Middle England with a
Whereabouts?
small... in Worcester, actually.
Worcester.
With a small university,
Yeah.
or a small to medium university, where the Vice-Chancellor gets paid more than 2.5 times what the Prime Minister gets paid. He gets more than double what the Chief Exec of the County Council gets paid. And we're told it's the market rate. Governance in universities is rotten to the core, I'm afraid, and we need to re-engage local communities with their institutions, so that not at Worcester, but another institution nearby, the Vice-Chancellor gets a grace and favour home and a driver and a car. These are relics of a bygone age and have no place, and our students are paying £9,000 a year for this sort of inflated... you wouldn't get away in a local authority doing it. How on earth do we get away with it in universities?
I'm not sure there was a question there, but I appreciated the sentiment. How do they get away with it? Okay. And what would you like to ask?
Hi, I'm Jess. I'm from Stirling. So I left school at 16 and went to work as an accountant doing an apprenticeship. So I'll be a chartered accountant at 21, and it's a great job, so I get paid all the way. But I was just wondering how, if we're telling people not to go to university, how can we make sure that there are the really high-level opportunities available and that they are high quality, high value, and not just the half-assed apprenticeships where people are trying to take advantage of the levies?
Excellent.
Very good point.
Okay, so Vice-Chancellors, are they crazily overpaid, and is governance rotten to the core? Steve, what do you think?
Yes, they are, I think. How do they get away with it? Well, it's rent-seeking, basically, to use the economist term for it. And it's an example of a phenomenon that isn't only found in universities, I have to say. It's where the people who set the pay are setting each other's pay, or it's a mutual back-scratching exercise, essentially, which you also find in a lot of large private firms, I have to say, hence inflation in chief executive pay. But that's what it is, basically. If the local community, or for that matter, the government or anybody else had any say in what was going on, if there was a truly competitive market for these positions, then you wouldn't be getting these rates of pay. Simple as that.
Yeah,
Darren,
I mean,
do
the
you wanna
problem
come
is exactly as you've just described. They sit on their own remuneration committees, and clearly they're recession-proof, austerity-proof. And when I come back to Earth, I'm going to, if I'm reincarnated, I will come back as a vice chancellor without any shadow of doubt. It is completely wrong what is going on, especially as I've argued that too many universities are not providing value for money. Which is what our committee report said, when they say they can't provide online for students, and yet they can have businesses in their universities holding business exhibitions, for example. And I think, I don't care, to be honest, if a vice-chancellor gets 10 million quid a year, if every single student in that university is getting a good graduate skilled job at the end of it, and there's lots of degree apprenticeships, and they have people from disadvantaged backgrounds succeeding, staying in the university and getting those good jobs as well, then I have a lesser problem with their wages. The problem is that there is no proper performance measure for the most part, because they just pat themselves on the back and give them huge salaries and cars and as you say, houses, pensions, you name it. They make us MPs look like look good in comparison. That's very rare, by the way. So,
Darren, would you like to come to this lady's point about how we make sure these apprenticeships and other options are high quality?
I actually think not enough people know about the options as well. That's it. So it's first of all about probably informing people that these options actually exist. I think. It is actually going back to basics. What I said about school choice and expanding that as far as kids being able to say at an earlier age, back when the sort of halcyon days of grammar schools, where people actually, I think, were able to be tested on ability and say, well, here's what you're good at. And you sort of get to know yourself a little bit more than I think you do today, which is a sort of on a wing and a prayer, let's just get this kid through this factory of university, which I don't think is working and isn't fit for purpose, as I said. On the university vice-chancellor point, I think it's actually disgusting that someone can make that amount of money whilst presiding over a culture that has meant that there are Conservative MPs, that I get emailed about this all the time on my website, Conservative MPs who are put up at universities, they are booked to speak to student unions, and like clockwork, it'll happen. The booking will have to be cancelled because the venue has had to get rid and rescind the offer because they've had pressure from student union groups and others. And what are vice-chancellors doing about this? They're kowtowing basically to it because they agree with the views of the students who are somewhere to the left of Chairman Mao that I mentioned earlier. And I think that is an outrageous abuse of freedom of expression and debate in our supposedly august universities.
well, even dare I say, if I can just come back on a couple of things, even worse what Darren is saying, if you happen to be a Jewish society or a pro-Israel society at university, then you know what happens? You invite an Israeli speaker along or a Jewish speaker, and the university then says you've got to hire security guards for a few thousand quid. Now, in other words, stopping that event from taking place, which is outrageous. And one thing we haven't discussed is the unbelievable amount of anti-Semitism, anti-Israel behaviour that there is on too many campuses across our country. Can I just say to you in a very appropriate way, you're my dream person, because everything I believe about apprenticeships is exactly what you've just described to everyone in this audience. The only thing I would say, it's not that I don't want people to go to university. I want people to go to university, but I want them to have a proper experience in the ways that I have described. And the way we change it, though, I would want a million of you, millions and millions of you. The only way we're going to change that is if we change careers in our schools, and that's another subject, because careers in our schools doesn't encourage apprenticeships. We should have a UCAS for further education and apprenticeships, and it should be, there is a thing called the Baker Clause, which I brought in when I was a minister, which said that schools had to teach about apprenticeships and skills, but they're not doing it. It's not being implemented properly, and Lord Baker's trying to toughen it up in the House of Lords at the moment. But that is the way. If we get change careers, then the parents will understand what apprenticeships are, and there'll be millions of you all over the country. And it won't just be one of you in this audience, it'll be every single one of you. And I'll tell you what my dream is. My dream is that I always describe this as, if you go to a dinner party and someone says they went to Oxbridge, people go, wow, wow. What I want it to happen, if I go to a dinner party and someone says they went to Oxbridge, I want someone to say, oh, that's nice. And then someone like you is there saying, I'm doing an apprenticeship in accountanship, I've got a job. And everyone goes, wow, wow, how did you do it? That's incredible. But that's what's wrong with our society. We only kind of give credit to the people who went to Oxbridge, who then go and work in the civil service or end up running the country.
I get the sense that is changing slightly. We'll ask a few more questions. I know I didn't come to you on that. Do you want to add very quickly a couple of thoughts on that? Or
Well, very quickly, I agree. I mean, there should be more opportunities for more people like you to do what you've done. The reality is that for 18-year-olds looking for a level 4 apprenticeship, a decent apprenticeship, there are less places than there are at Oxford. There are less places than there are at a single university, a small university. So let's just bear that in mind. On the VC point, I mean, none of you would be surprised to see that I'm not a Vice-Chancellor. I will never be a Vice-Chancellor. I do agree with you on the local focus, by the way. I mean, what I would say, and I won't defend Vice-Chancellors' salaries very often, but the two universities I'm most associated with, University of Manchester here, our Vice-Chancellor, Nancy Rothwell, is amongst the kind of lowest paid in the Russell Group, at a level that you will see as kind of the same as a chief executive of a multi-academy trust in the school sector, lower than some, actually. And you will see it kind of roughly comparable to kind of a local authority chief exec. So now, that might be a bad set of comparisons, but I think it's one worth making. And I'll say one further thing about the organisation that she runs, which is that its turnover, now you might say this is crazy, is more than Manchester City, Manchester United and Manchester Airport put together. It's a pretty big organisation. Now, does that mean it deserves a salary of X, Y or Z? I don't know.
Okay, let's take a few at a time because we haven't got long to go. Who should we take? This chap at the back, and then this lady here, and who else? And Sherelle over there.
So I want to echo the point Robert brought up about anti-Semitism. I am a Jewish student on campus, and whenever we do message the Vice-Chancellor, you know what he says? Not my problem and I don't care. I guarantee you if I misgendered someone, he would be all over me like a hawk. Anti-Semitism, they don't care. They want to know what school was bringing him the money because 1% of students are Jewish. And yes, they are paid ridiculous amounts. They don't speak to students. We've never met the guy. He sits behind the screen and does absolutely nothing to help his students. And I'd also like to ask the question mainly to Robert. What is the government doing in regards to in-person teaching? Last year, I had 8 hours of in-person. This year, I've been cut to 4 hours. I was cut to 2 hours last week until begging to change my timetable. Can the government do something similar, which they did with the IHRA, demanding universities to give more in-person teaching or cut funding?
Okay, over here.
Hi, I'm a PhD student at the University of Warwick, so finally getting some worth out of my education. But I just wanted to ask, there's a big thing about the social role and the social purpose of university, of young people leaving home for the first time, learning to cook, like that kind of thing. So how does that fit into the ideas of like degree apprenticeships and those other options, especially with people not being able to like get on the housing market and not being able to move out, and they want that independence. So how does that play a role in this debate, basically?
Okay, and over here. Sherelle over there in the third row.
So we talked a lot about universities' function as a job producer, but I'm quite interested in the university's function in teaching people how to think. And I was wondering what the panel thinks about the profundity of the intellectual crisis that universities in this country may be going through. It seems to me that in the social sciences, humanities, maybe in some of the soft sciences, researchers scholars seem to be stuck in a bit of an intellectual cul-de-sac with neo-Marxism. Perhaps it's quite a resilient framework for analysing postmodern stuff, I don't know, but it seems to me they can't get past it. And also this culture of hostility towards the polymath as well. I find quite interesting this idea that even at the top of your career, you can critique the parts, but perhaps not the whole. You can't question the whole. And whether, just to get your thoughts really on the profundity of the crisis and what we can do about it as well.
Okay, if we go to the panel, we start perhaps in reverse. Are we facing an intellectual crisis in our universities? Is there too much neo-Marxism, seeing everything through a postmodern lens, that is stopping us from finding the truth? Who would like to start on that one, Steve?
I'll start if I like. Yes, there is an intellectual crisis. I don't think it's Marxism, actually. I think, actually, Marx must be turning in his grave at some of the things that people are now saying in his name, because he was a materialist, and all these people that you mentioned, they're actually it's all a matter of ideas and words that control the world, apparently, which Marx would have been absolutely horrified by that kind of argument, bourgeois sentimentalism. Where does this come from? I think it comes because universities have lost their sight of their real mission, which is scholarship and the pursuit of truth and the exploration of ideas. Instead, they've allowed themselves to become certification machines, basically, because that's what there's a high demand for. And that also brings in tons of goodies, because they can then go to the politicians and say, oh, well, if we have more graduates, we'll have bigger GDP. When in fact the causal link is the other way around. It's rich countries that can afford to have lots of university students. And I think that the only way to for universities and higher education in the Anglo-Saxon world, certainly, to recover their original mission is to stop being what they are now, which is essentially, and what they're selling themselves as, which is basically as a kind of career enhancer. That's what I think very much so. The question in the middle there about the role of university as a kind of rite of passage to adulthood, that's a very distinctively English thing, I have to say. I went to university in Scotland. In Scotland, like most of the students at Glasgow University, for example, come from Greater Glasgow. It's only the English who have this idea that you need to leave home and go away and live in a kind of late teenage boarding school environment as part of a rite of passage. And every other country in the world, people manage to, find their way into adulthood and learn all the kind of social skills without having to go away and live in halls of residence on the other side of the country and clog up the nation's train system every weekend for 4 years. So I'm highly relaxed about people going much more to local universities and not travelling away so much. And as I say, I don't know why the English have this thing. It's a peculiarly English phenomenon.
Yes, I'm not sure I learned how to be an adult from a university myself. Anyway, Robert, would you like to come back on any of those questions?
Yeah, so on the, I'm not an expert in Marxist philosophy, but what I would say is, I don't know if were you there, have you been here for the whole talk from the beginning? So when I was talking about changing the nature of universities and making sure that all courses are embedded in career and work, I think that would change the nature of teaching and lecturing, because no one's going to have time for Marxism, because the kids are going to be working, trying to earn a living to make sure that the curriculum prepares them for work. And I think the teaching habits, and if more people were doing, how many teachers who teach degree apprenticeships practice Marxism? Very few, I suspect. So that, I think, if you change the culture of universities, then you will change some of the culture that you are describing. In terms of you, what is your PhD in, by the way? Yes.
Actually, it's with a museum, so I look at engineering and museums and history.
Okay.
So there is that link.
So clearly you're going to get a great job afterwards. But I do go back to my central point. It is lovely to leave home. I left home. I was very lucky. It wasn't even loans, because the state paid for my university at the time. But the fact is, in my view, the central purpose of university must be about getting people jobs. And all the other stuff is the icing on the cake, but the cake has to be about getting people into work, and that's what we have to change, and that's not what is not happening at the moment. And I think at the end of the day, it's a mixture of loan and taxpayer subsidy, and so you have to be wary that the taxpayer only has so much limited funds, and students only have limited funds today. The interest rates are high enough as it is. So if you say, well, everybody can just go to wherever they want to, if they're going to, it's very hard to do that if under the current system that we have. But university must be predominantly about the world of work.
Thank you. Darren, we've got woke vice-chancellors who care more about misgendering than, I don't know, anti-Semitism. Oh, and we have the concern that we're in an intellectual crisis in our university.
I think it is true that, if you were to misgender someone, use the wrong pronoun, all these other things, you would be pulled up a hell of a lot quicker than you would be if you, called for the extermination of the state of Israel, right? It's that sort of thing where there is a real double standard in the way in which what universities care about. I think it's really important that what I was going to say one thing that Gavin Williamson did that I quite liked. Rest in peace. I know he's not dead, but he would be enshrining, protecting free speech and actually saying that we have a right to speak freely, and I think that's really important because that has been lost from universities, especially, and I think that feeds into Sherelle's point actually on the fact that universities are supposed to be there to teach people how to think. Well, 14 million people voted Tory in 2019, but you cannot get a Tory MP to speak on a campus in some places because, the student unions will kick off a fuss and say, Rob Halfon thinks that women have a cervix and therefore he can't come and speak. I don't know if that is your view. I hope it's your view. And he can't come and speak on campus. So never mind teaching students how to think. They're not even able to hear, right? That's how bad it's getting. So I think fundamentally there's a free speech crisis on campus. And that's what we've got to address. That's what we've got to get serious about. Because it's all well and good saying, well, we'll get there eventually, we'll get more apprenticeships and things like that. The 50% target, if you've got 50% of kids coming out of university somewhere to the left of Chairman Mao, well, guess what they're going to vote for in the next few years? It ain't going to be pretty, folks. So I'm not at all optimistic that we are doing the right things on teaching people how to think and all those rest of the things. But I think on that point that you raised there, the Secretary of State, and it's not very free market, so don't press the eject button on me, Emily, but I think the Secretary of State for Levelling Up, or whatever he's called these days, but it's Michael Gove's new post, actually saying that, it shouldn't be, the raison d'etre of a kid shouldn't be, I will have achieved the pinnacle and everything in life if I manage to get a graduate job in London. Right, I do actually think that they've got to be decentralising London, moving away from London, and I know you'll agree with that, Manchester. I think that's incredibly important. So the Secretary of State for Levelling Up, I'd say, he might be intervening in one too many markets, but there we are. More power to his elbow, I say.
Good stuff. We need to wrap things up quickly, but Andrew.
I just agree with that. Let me find something to agree with. Yeah, absolutely. And I think we do need to think quite carefully about the different roles of different universities in different places. So, a university that we will both know in Wolverhampton is a different university to the university in Manchester that I work at. And there is a new office. Michael Gove will be visiting this new building outside the station. So, we need to accept that kind of there is a pretty diverse sector out there doing different things. But I think we should also acknowledge that there is a bit of a tension between the kind of, the work focus, the kind of, this is all about getting a good job. I don't deny that. But we should accept that there is a tension between that and the kind of diversity of thought thing. My view is that universities on the whole do a pretty good job at balancing those things, and obviously it varies across courses and institutions. That's my experience in the sector when I teach, and kind of amongst my colleagues that I teach with, and to sort of develop the diversity of thought bit. And I can see the fear that we're all turning out neo-Marxists and people without that diversity of thought. Let me reassure you that on the course I teach, I think the last 3 guest speakers I've had, one was Rachel Wolfe last year, one before was Nick Hillman, who was best advisor to David Willits. And if anybody on the panel wants to come and help me teach my masters in public policy, you'll be very welcome.
I'd love to. Well, there we go. We're going to have to finish there. Thank you so much for all your questions and for coming to this event. Thank you to my speakers, Robert, Darren, Andrew and Steve. Please do pick up a copy of Steve's latest paper over there in the corner before you leave. Thanks for coming.
Well, if you enjoyed that conversation, why not watch one of these other videos? And while you're here, remember to hit the subscribe button and the notification bell. That way, you'll never miss out on a single IEA broadcast.